welcome back to our channel. Today we're going to discuss chapter 11 of the book, The Ending of Time. And this chapter examines the genesis of psychological knowledge and its relationship with the liberation of the mind. We could probably start off with a hypothesis, and that is the human mind always follows a certain pattern. The tendency for the mind to follow a certain pattern is then being discussed, and a certain type of knowledge is being discussed in particular, and that is what they call psychological knowledge. So it's probably good if we try to come up with a definition of the term. So as I understand it, psychological knowledge refers to the notion of a me accumulating data and thereby reinforcing that notion of me. It refers to knowledge that a me or self collects, both of its surroundings and, in consequence of itself vis-a-vis those surroundings. So, to give you an example, you can have knowledge of there being a country, for instance, the United States, and you can have knowledge of your having been born in that country or living in this country. So you have knowledge of being American, and you identify with being an American, most likely. So in the process, you tend to forget or disregard that there has to be a notion of me in the first place that is at the root of all this identification. So you go on living your life and you, based on your, and you base your decisions partially on the notion that you are American. And it is logical that it'll get harder for you, as time goes on, to disidentify with being an American and to disidentify with the notion of having a me in the first place, because the stakes get higher and higher as you go along, because you have identified with both, at some period of time, at some point in time, and everything you've been doing ever since you identified with it has sort of been built on that notion, so and that state of affairs can be captured in a second hypothesis, and that is the mind tends to cling to psychological knowledge. So it's saying that, as I said before, it becomes harder and harder over time for the mind to realize that the me constitutes psychological knowledge, and that this psychological knowledge in turn gives the me importance, and that's sort of what keeps the mind from being free, or at least that's what is being proposed in this chapter. But let's turn to a short excerpt that underlines what we've just concluded. It also introduces an important new aspect, I think. So what shall I do? I have been watching for many years people attempting to become free from certain things. This is the root of it, you understand. This psychological accumulation which becomes psychological knowledge. And so it divides and all kinds of things happen around it and within it, and yet the mind refuses to let go. Yes. Why? Is that because there is safety or security in it? That is part of it. But I think in some way that knowledge has taken on the significance of the absolute instead of being relative. So, what's the important new aspect that I mentioned? Well, it's the distinction between absolute and relative knowledge. And if you think about it, knowledge is not only relative in that it is relative to a me, which is accumulating knowledge and therefore tends to follow an agenda. Knowledge is also relative in that it is relative to the constrictions of our very sensory perception, of our sensory perception apparatus. It is restricted to the faculties a generation of humans might have at a certain time, for instance, the faculty to be able to see color. But it is also relative to the capacity of an individual brain. For instance, when you are clinically depressed, your capacity to compute information declines radically. So it's just important to bear that in mind. And that's not even starting to talk about, the problem that human beings, based on the knowledge they gathered, might claim that their knowledge is absolute or points to something absolute, So what could free the mind from psychological knowledge is the realization that it is built on a faulty foundation, on this idea of a me, and yet it is the me which resists that realization. And I'm going to read you another short excerpt. So what shall I do, realizing that this knowledge is inevitably forming a groove in which I live? How am I to break it down? Well, I'm not sure that it is generally clear to people that this knowledge does all that, or that the knowledge is knowledge. You see, it may seem to some being, the self, and me. This knowledge creates the me, and the me is the experience as an entity, which seems not to be knowledge, but some real being. Are you saying that this being is different from knowledge? It appears to be. It feigns a difference. But is it? It isn't, but the illusion has great power. That has been our conditioning. Yes. Now the question is, how do we get through that to break down the groove? Because it creates the imitation or pretension of a state of being. So what is outlined here is that, and I think we have to go back to something that I probably told you 100 million times before, but it's really important to remember that. So the whole notion of when you have a sensory perception, the idea of a me sort of arises parallel to having a perception. So when maybe we should formulate it differently, and that's sort of pointing to the limitations of our language once more. So if a human being, let's put it that way, perceives something, sees, for example, an object, the brain creates, or I can't even say the brain, but let's just say what's being created parallel to having that perception is that there is a perceiver having this perception, So having a perception, seeing something, implies that there is someone, a me, who sees something. So it's really close together, It's like, since it's part of the same process, it's really hard to separate it, It's really hard to realize that the me, or the notion of a me or an I, is a byproduct of, perceiving things, of having perceptions, So when you think of knowledge is sort of like an accumulation of perceptions over time. So if the perception, like if one perception is built on the notion, or is closely entangled, let's say, with the notion of having a me, then one should think that over time, as you accumulate knowledge, that notion will get reinforced a lot more. So you then not only identify with things like I'm a human being or I'm an American, but you might identify with some, political view, I'm, radical this or that, or I have a certain creed, I believe in Christianity or in Judaism or Buddhism or Islam or whatever, So that notion of me, that in the beginning was maybe sort of like marginal, when you were a little kid, gets stronger and stronger over time. So it'll get much harder for you to even see that is what's standing in the way of your mind being free and liberated. And if I speak of freedom and liberation, I don't mean this in any dogmatic way at all. Like, I'm just saying it in relation to being identified with that me. So disidentifying from that me is sort of like everything is all that has to happen, in my opinion. It's not like you have to believe in God, or it's not that you have to believe in a certain creed in order to get there, but you just have to pretty much understand that that's what's happening, is that when beings who have brains, who are as far developed as our brains are, beings who can be conscious of themselves, tend to identify with a lot of things. First of all, with having a me or having a body, or and now all this sort of commotion starts with, well, if I have a body, I probably have a soul and all that. So it all starts with that notion of me, and at least that's what this book keeps saying. So let's put two more hypotheses. The idea of a me is a wall that needs to be broken down. And the second one, this wall can be broken down through love and intelligence. I'm putting this second hypothesis, because it's being said in the text, and I think it's one of those statements, that are hard to accept for probably most of you or most people. But it comes from Krishnamurti, and he was a living example of this. Let me just try to formulate this as neutral as I can. So it appears that human beings who are disidentified with me or ego display a great deal of compassion, and it seems that people who are disidentified from the notion of me seem to be in a state of just acceptance and in a very loving state. So, and I think what's being said with that statement is that those things sort of coincide, let's just leave it at that. I think it's important to make that statement because it tends to get lost, and I don't want this to be solely an intellectual exercise, so there's your connection to unconditional love. If you've been looking for that connection, here it is. So Krishnamurti attempts to explain this, and he also outlines a danger that one runs into in the process of trying to tear that wall down. I am this side of the wall, and you are asking me to have that love and intelligence which will destroy it. But I don't know what that love is, what that intelligence is, because I am caught in this and this other side, on this other side of the wall. I realize logically, sanely, that what you are saying is accurate, true, logical, and I see the importance of it. But the wall is so strong and dominant and powerful that I can't get beyond it. We said the other day that the wall could be broken down through insight, if insight does not become translated into an idea. Yes. When insight is discussed, there is the danger of our making an abstraction of it, which means we move away from the fact and the abstraction becomes all important, which means, again, knowledge. And the reason why I'm pointing this out or highlighting this section is that apart from the tendency for me to be created when we have perceptions, once that me has been created, and once the being identified with that me, and once knowledge has been built up, there's a tendency to, whatever comes your way, you conceptualize it, So the me tends to conceptualize whatever comes at it, conceptualize perceptions. So it is the me that conceptualizes which stands in the way of what previously in the book we came upon, which was called pure perception. So pure perception means perceiving without, nurturing a sense of meanness or I-ness when perceiving, when having a perception. So technically, and I think it's not the first time we come across this, technically insight can transfer from one human being to another. Remember how in previous chapters we discussed how it can't be acquired, because the minute you want to acquire something, that points to you're having a me who wants something, so that would be sort of like the wrong thing to do. So technically it's possible that insight sort of transfers from one individual to another, but it requires the other individual who doesn't have insight yet to sort of listen, to listen very closely. And of course to listen to someone who has insight. And it requires a type of listening, that we could probably call pure perception. So a kind of listening that does not cling to the conception of a me. I'm going to read another excerpt for that. Would you say that the capacity to listen is far more important than any explanations or logic? The brain has the capacity to listen. We have to question whether the ordinary man is so full of opinions that he can't listen. You can't listen with opinions. You might just as well be dead. I think knowledge has all sorts of defenses. Is it possible for, say, the ordinary man to have this perception? That is really what you're asking, isn't it? I feel it is dreadfully simple somehow. If one could listen with all one's being, the brain would not be caught in that groove. You see, generally in communication, you are telling me something and I am absorbing it, but there is an interval between your telling me and my absorbing. Yes. And that interval is the danger. If I don't absolutely absorb, listen with all my being, it's finished. And this is a really interesting point, is that, and it seems logical, that as soon as you have the me established and the perception comes your way, the me tends to act as a sort of gatekeeper. Whatever perception you have, it will put a tax on that perception. It'll judge it. The me tends to judge, perceptions, and if you are interested in pursuing this further, there is you probably know or have heard about Ian McGilchrist. He is a psychiatrist and philosopher, and he recently came out with a book called The Matter with Things, and it's 2 huge volumes, and in it he analyzes, he claims to have identified which hemisphere of the brain is prone to making such judgments, So now I'm not going to say that, I'm not going to claim that the idea of me is created in the left hemisphere, but there seems to be, and that's what's quite interesting in Ian McGilchrist's research, is that there seems to be a propensity for one hemisphere, which is the left one, to perceive the world in a certain way, and that seems to coincide, or that seems to be coinciding with what I've just discussed before, is that sort of judgmental and that judgmental tendency. So I'm going to link Ian McGilchrist's channel in the description box, because he has, of course, I would suggest you get his book and you read it, but if you don't want to do that, he has a series of videos in which he discusses each chapter of his book. So if you don't want to read, you can listen to those and maybe get something out of them. So this interval is the me, I think, and it stands in the way of pure perception, and it is sort of like the emissary that conceptualizes what is being perceived, and it puts it into relation to the notion of the me. So, lastly, we turn to the meaning of the term identification, which I think is worthwhile as well, and I'll read you a last short excerpt for that. Now, what is the root meaning of identification? Always the same. Always the same, that's right. There is nothing new under the sun. You say the self is always the same. It tries to be always the same in essence, if not in detail. Yes, yes. I think this is the thing that goes wrong with knowledge. It attempts to be involved with what is always the same, so it sticks, you see. Knowledge itself tries to find what is permanent and perfect, even independent of any of us. So the mind which is functioning with the me is always the same mind. We have tried everything, fasting, every kind of discipline, to get rid of the me with all its knowledge and illusions. One tries to identify with something else, which is the same thing. One then comes back to the fundamental question, what will make the blank wall totally disappear? I think this is only possible when the man who is blocked can give total attention to what the free man is saying. There is no other means to break down that wall, not the intellect, not the emotions, nor anything else. When somebody has gone beyond that wall, who has broken it down, says, listen, for God's sake, listen. And I listen to him with my mind empty. Then it is finished. You know what I'm saying? I have no sense of hoping for anything to happen or anything to come back or concern with the future. The mind is empty and therefore listening. It is finished. For a scientist to discover something new, he must have a certain emptiness from which there will be a different perception. Emptiness in which there is no movement of thought as psychological knowledge, and therefore no psychological time. And I think, it's a bold statement to say that the only way for individuals to get out of that sort of ego illusion is to listen to somebody who already got out of it. That seems a harsh predicament, because what happens if, there is no free people left. So what happens if there's no one who is identified with the me? But let's just accept it for now, and let's see what the next chapter brings. I hope this has been helpful in some way, and if you like the videos, please like, share, subscribe, and I'll see you next time. Bye.